So the theme of today is kind of talking about not only slave life, but the advent of slave rebellion. Now, there were smaller rebellions, of course, all the way through the 16 and early 1700s, but there are four that really kind of become the standard for what we look at when it comes to slave rebellions and what causes them. Because I don't know if you caught, but the readings for this week, chapter 4 out of Stamped was talking about Cotton Mather and discussing his not only religious background but the social background of Massachusetts, which a lot of people I think forget. Massachusetts did have slavery at the early stages of their colonization when they were the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that slowly gets eliminated later on. More towards the American Revolution when you start seeing slavery outlawed within that colony and eventual state. The other reading was talking about the Deep South, specifically South Carolina, and the Stono Rebellion. And they kind of go into the Stono Rebellion. And had you read it, that first one would be very easy to actually, do the assignment. And again, you should have up the little chart assignment over slave uprisings. It's the second assignment for the week. The first one I'll go over here before I let you all go. But again, if you have that up, and kind of ready to type a few notes here, you'll get credit for that assignment. So again, the first reading was chapter 4 in Stamped, which was mostly over Cotton Mather, who was a religious leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he the author Reynolds and Kendi basically make the argument that his treatment of witchcraft, his treatment of anybody that went outside the norm of the expectations or the social constructs of the colony, whether it be religious, whether it be just society in general, tended to be branded. And that gets spilled over onto, weirdly enough, the slaves that are within the colony. So if you remember from 8th grade, I think they talked a little bit about the Salem witch trial, and they talk about it in chapter 4 here, that all comes out of a misunderstanding of the gospel and the misunderstanding of kind of the presentation of religious teachings. Yet somehow, and Kendi and Reynolds make it very clear, somehow that then becomes a black problem. That how is it that these white people of Salem have this huge witchcraft, witch trial, if you will, put a bunch of people to death, and then afterwards there's a new set of racist codes that come along as if the blacks had something to do with it. These African slaves, did they really have anything to do with it? No. So Salem is nothing but scapegoating. They scapegoat, these women for these horrible things that are happening in the colony. And then after it's all said and done, they lay the blame at the feet of slaves. Somehow that's how they connect it, which is ridiculous, we all know. But that's kind of what happens here. And that's what Kendi kind of wants to point out is it's a ridiculous summation. It's a ridiculous way of kind of coming to that conclusion that somehow this racist codes that no interracial relationships, they're going to tax imported captives. So any slaves that come into the colony from that point on, they're going to tax. They're going to classify natives and blacks the same way as you would horses and hogs. Blacks can't hold office. All property owned by a slave is sold, which of course contributes to black poverty. And the white indentured servants who were freed are awarded 50 acres of property, of course contributing to white prosperity. So this is in line with, if you remember last week, talking about Bacon's Rebellion, where when the whites rebel, it's almost kind of like they're trying to find a way to accommodate the rebels. They're trying to, make them fit back into society and kind of buy them off. But if a slave rebels, then it's a problem. So that's kind of why I included the reading from the Stono Rebellion, which was from the book 400 Souls, which was an anthology of essays put together by Ibram X. Kendi, who is the professor who wrote Stamped from the Beginning, along with Keisha Blaine, who is a professor in Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, and she's the leader of the African American Studies department there. They kind of put together all these essays, and we're going to use some of the essays as we go through the course as well. So, bottom line is, we're going to kind of wrap up the colonial part of this next week. But the colonies here, think about last week we talked about how when Bacon rebelled, it was Western farmers who were really kind of dirt poor against these plantation owners in the east of Virginia. And Bacon, I mean, he sets fire to Jamestown. He, tries to kind of basically overthrow the government of William Berkeley. And he does all of this. And granted, he dies of dysentery, so it's not like there's any repercussions for him. But his followers, if they're white, they're almost granted absolution, like, oh, we understand you were upset. But if you were a native or if you were a slave and you were part of the uprising, or even if you were a freed black and you were part of Bacon's rebellion, you were treated without mercy. You were, kind of paraded through the streets as public enemy number one. So this is kind of the difference here. And you see a marked difference when it comes to uprisings of slaves and the treatment of these people. So what I'd like you to do again on that chart this week, and again, it's the second assignment for the week here, is look at the four different slave uprisings. And again, if you have that up, we're going to go through them. So we're going to start with the Stono Rebellion, which you had within your readings. This is the first major slave uprising that typically is talked about in American history. Happens in 1739 in South Carolina. And this is right before, just to put it into context, this is right before Georgia even forms as a colony. Georgia is not even a colony yet. It's not even a thought yet. So South Carolina technically is the southernmost colony at that point and close to Spanish Florida. So there is a general concern that Florida is going to be a problem for South Carolina. And the reason that is the Spanish had outlawed slavery within Florida and had basically spread the word that if any slave could get to St. Augustine, which was the first permanent colony in North America, if any slave could get to St. Augustine, that the Spanish would basically free them. Okay, the Spanish would allow them to live in freedom. Now, that's what they said. The reality was quite different. Yes, they were free, but freedom was kind of a sliding scale of understanding. So what ends up happening is some of these slaves within South Carolina hear about this opportunity to get free, and around what is known as the Stono River, they hold a meeting. They hold a meeting to kind of plan out how are they going to get to St. Augustine. So they basically attack a general store. They rob it. They steal guns and ammunition and swords and things. They behead the two people working at this general store. And then they go on a reign of terror. They go around to different plantations and kill the plantation owners. And they kill roughly 20 to 25 people, depending upon the account. Okay. Now, the problem is when they do this, they also raid the goods, the services, the whatever else of these plantations. And when they do that, they unfortunately, find some rum and other spirits. So they start celebrating. They feel like, hey, we've won. We're now capable of going on to Florida, and nobody's going to be able to stop us. So they stop in a field to kind of have a celebratory, party about this. The problem is that the people of South Carolina have heard about this, and they get their posse up. They get their group of vigilantes out with the sheriff. They track these people down, and they end up killing many of them in the field. And then the rest are strung up and hanged for inciting a riot, a revolution, if you will. Now, why does this become a bigger deal outside of the reading? This is also known as Cato's conspiracy. And Cato was the name given to a slave named Jemmy, Jemmy. Jemmy was a slave from a Portuguese colony. So he grew up basically in the Caribbean and then came to South Carolina as a free man, basically. He had earned his freedom. He was literate, so he knew how to read and write. He learned how to speak English, obviously, and he kind of became the default leader of this rebellion, leading people out of slavery. So when he recruited about 60 other slaves to go down to St. Augustine and ended up, like I said, killing 20 to 25 whites, it was kind of like this loose association, and they kind of felt like, well, we'll just go unopposed all the way down to Florida. That's not what happened. The whites, of course, rose up, and then afterwards they passed what was known as the Negro Act of 1740. The Negro Act of 1740 basically said we're going to limit the assembly of blacks, that blacks cannot, gather in large numbers, that blacks cannot educate each other, that we are going to limit whether or not people can be literate, and we are going to limit their movement. If and this used to be a big thing, that if a plantation owned a slave, they could loan the slave out to another plantation, and that slave would get paid for their work outside of the plantation. So if that plantation is making rice or something and they're done with their work on the plantation, they could then go over to the next rice plantation and help out with their crop. This was normal thing. You just allow them to travel over to this other plantation, no supervision. It was just they would come back at the end of the day to get their rations, to go back to their home, if you will, on the plantation, whatever else. They limit that. The South Carolina legislature basically says, we're done with that. We're not going to allow that anymore. So that's all kind of the fallout. So what do they take away? They take away education. They take away assembly, which is a big deal, because where do these slaves typically assemble? If not for work, they're assembling to actually go to church. This is one of the byproducts of justifying slavery. Is a lot of these white slave owners would say, well, we're Christianizing them. We're allowing them to learn the Christian religion. So therefore, churches were fairly, important within the community, for the African-American community especially. Well, if you limit the amount of African-Americans that can meet in one location, they may not be able to go to church, or they might have to go to other churches and spread out, if you will. So this becomes kind of hard to enforce, but at the same time, it is enforced, and it changes the mindset of where these, what the status is of these slaves within the community. So that's the Stono Rebellion. Now, Gabriel's conspiracy in 1800, Gabriel's uprising, as it's known as well, is led by a guy named Gabriel Prosser. Prosser was born in 1776. So by the year 1800, he's only 24 years old. So he's still a very young man. Now, he was born on a tobacco plantation. He was taught to be a blacksmith. Most people believe that his father was a blacksmith as well, because most of the time it was kind of skills like that were passed from father to son. And he had the ability to read and write. He was literate as well. So you're noticing a common theme between these leaders of these uprisings is they could read and write. He was influenced by the American Revolution that was happening at the time, and he had heard and read about Haiti. For those of you that forget your freshman year, you might have learned in your world studies class about Toussaint Louverture, who was a Haitian slave who led a rebellion against the French government in Haiti and threw the French out. So it was the largest successful slave uprising. And there was general fear within the colonies that, hey, they're going to, and now the United States in 1800, that they're going to learn from the Haitians about how to do this. And in many places of the South, the slaves did outnumber the white people. So there was general concern that, hey, they're going to learn from the Haitians how to do this. And Prosser takes this to heart. He hatches a plan to take James Monroe, the eventual president of the United States, but at the time, the governor of Virginia, hostage. So he basically comes up with a plan that they're going to raid the Capitol. They're going to surround the governor's mansion. They're going to take James Monroe and other government officials hostage, so that way they would get safe passage. And the idea was they would then commandeer a ship and go north. Now, why? In 1800, many of those states, like Massachusetts, had outlawed slavery by that point. Slavery was no longer allowed in those states. So they thought, well, we'll just get on a ship, we'll go north, and we will go to freedom. The problem is that their plan, while it was very ambitious, was delayed by torrential rain. There was a huge storm that came in on the day that they were going to do it. Now, a lot of historians have looked at this and said, what if the rain had not come? Would they have been successful? We don't know. Obviously, there's a lot of what ifs in this scenario, but the rain basically causes a few of the slaves in the conspiracy to get cold feet. And there was a general feeling that if I tell the master about this uprising, then the master is going to treat me better. That I'm going to have a distinguished, position within the plantation. So a couple of these slaves basically sell out Gabriel and his followers. And sure enough, the whole rebellion falls apart even before it starts. Gabriel eventually is caught on a ship going north. He had kind of stowed away, but he was sold out by another slave on that ship. He had found out kind of who he was, and he turned him in for the ransom money. which a lot of blacks at the time were labeling that person Judas. It was a slave named Billy who basically realized that if Gabriel gets caught, there was a $300 reward, which was a tremendous amount of money. He ended up getting about $50, which still was quite a bit of money, especially for a slave. But again, it was, you're selling out this guy for money, which is very biblical in its own right. So Gabriel was eventually caught. He was eventually hanged with 26 others of his followers. And again, it's another slave rebellion that, didn't really live up to what they expected they were going to do. And it's mostly because they were sold out. Now, the third one was Denmark Vesey in 1822. And you'll notice, again, South Carolina. So there are some, kind of consistency here of the colonies where you would typically, or now states where you would typically see this, because this is the state of South Carolina at this point. He is born into slavery in the Caribbean, and he had earned his freedom, very similar to Prosser, very similar to, a lot of these leaders, is that they had kind of gained their freedom over time. And he had learned to be a carpenter in Charleston. So he had basically left the Caribbean, a place called St. Thomas. He had left the Caribbean, come up to Charleston, and become a carpenter. He was a founding member of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. So again, a product of that Negro Act was that, hey, you couldn't gather in large groups, so they had to splinter off. And so he was one of the founding members of one of these splinter churches, which the high irony here is that the AME Church eventually establishes itself in Charleston. It kind of survives Denmark Vesey's uprising, if you will, and eventually becomes one of the oldest churches in Charleston, and highly, just an odd occurrence, if you will. I don't know if you know who Dylann Roof is. He was the white supremacist, crazy kid who decided that he was going to go to a prayer meeting at a church, pray with these African-American parishioners, and then shoot them. That happened years ago, but that happened at the AME Church. So literally the church that Vesey was a part of founding, that's the church that saw one of the worst and quite honestly, one of the most heinous acts of terrorism, domestic terrorism ever, where this guy basically worshiped with these 9 people and then basically executed them. And he was trying to start a race war. This is one of the worst human beings you could ever possibly imagine. Same church, weirdly enough, 200 years roughly later, this event happened at the same church that we're talking about here. Not the same actual building, but the same congregation, if you will. Now, he was inspired, Denmark Vesey was inspired, being from the Caribbean, from tales of Toussaint Louverture and the Haitian Rebellion, and he kind of thought, well, we can do that here. He and his followers were basically deceived, though, by some slaves looking to gain favor from their masters, so very similar to what happened to Gabriel. Roughly 35, including Vesey, were eventually hanged for their role in this. And the church that he founded, the actual structure, was torn down and burned, but the congregation rebuilt. And that's kind of where you get this new AME Church within Charleston, is the congregation refused to kind of allow their Methodist faith to be affected by this slave uprising. But again, you have a very persuasive leader again, and somebody that was sold out by his followers. So commonality, common themes between these uprisings. The final one, and probably the most notorious out of all of them, was Nat Turner. And the reason it's the most notorious is it was really the one that came closest to working, I guess. Nat was born on a plantation to a master that basically taught him how to read, write, and he taught him religion. And Nat took to it. He was very much interested. He read the Bible a lot. He read a lot of Enlightenment thought. He read history. He was a student of basically the world, if you will. And his master was totally fine with this. Now, his other masters within the community were not, and this was a guy named Turner. Nat was a slave on Turner's plantation, hence Nat Turner. But Turner also managed to kind of farm him out, not as a worker, but as a preacher. Again, this idea that we were going to separate African Americans and keep slaves separate so that there's not as much communication. This man decided, hey, I'm going to loan Turner out for a little bit of labor, but he's also going to preach to these people, because Turner felt like Nat should be kind of their voice to convert these slaves to Christianity. So Nat Turner becomes kind of this fiery preacher among the slaves, and he witnesses an eclipse of the sun. Nat Turner one day is out in the fields. He looks up, the sun is eclipsed. He doesn't quite understand what's going on, but he takes it as a sign from God that that slavery is going away, that this is the night of slaves, that we're kind of allowed now by God to go off and rebel. So he is basically on the Travis family plantation when he notices this, and he rallies the slaves there to an uprising where they kill the entire Travis family. Now, he does not go back and try and kill his former master. He is okay with Turner, but he moves on with his followers and eventually kills an estimated 55 whites, all of them slave owners, plantation owners, if you will, and their families. Eventually, Turner is captured with about 75 of his followers, and a massive amount of them are hanged for their role within the conspiracy. Now, this is the one that inspires harsh codes against Black education. They basically say, hey, we told you not to allow these people to read and write. And his former slave owner, Turner, is brought up on charges, too, for teaching a slave how to read and write. So when you hear the stories about, slaves were not allowed to read and write, that's more of an 1800s thing. That comes after these rebellions. And they start realizing that education is the key to, limiting what the slaves know about. Like if we can limit the education, if we can limit them from what they're reading and what they're talking about, then they're not going to be able to organize. They're not going to be able to learn about liberty and freedom. They're not going to know what the Declaration of Independence is. They're not going to know, the only thing they know is the Bible. And what do in those services? They make sure that, slavery is presented as a human condition. So they don't really play up Exodus as much with Moses, but they do play up the fact that Jews were slaves. They play up the idea that the Romans had slaves. They play up the idea that Jesus was not a leader of a country as much as he was a religion, and that Jesus was not there to free you here, but to free your soul for eternal glory, if you will. So there is a definite usage of the lack of education for these people, the lack of reading and writing, to kind of skew the narrative to where these people basically are enslaved in totality. Okay, that they're kind of put into slavery, and kind of accepted as just that's how it is. Okay, so those are the slave rebellions. Do they all have things in common? Yeah, they have persuasive leaders. They have people that, for the most part, knew how to read and write. For the most part, had a basic education. They were influenced by outside influences, whether it be the American Revolution, whether it be the Haitian Revolution, whether it be the Bible. They were influenced in some way, shape, or form for freedom. So they understood the concept, and a lot of times they were sold out. They were sold out by others, or their leaders didn't quite understand how. Like, they knew how to get it started, but not to continue it. Okay. Now, the biggest slave uprising that's probably going to, pique your interest, if you will, is John Brown's Raid. That happens in 1859. John Brown's Raid is the one that, John Brown, a white man, tries to rally the slaves of Harper's Ferry, Virginia, to go against the local government. And he was going to lead basically a slave army down through the South and liberate everyone. Now, of course, that didn't work, and he was eventually hanged. So there's also a white man who gets involved in these slave uprisings, and there were others as well, but John Brown's kind of the main one, who eventually becomes a martyr for the cause and becomes kind of the firebrand that starts the Civil War, depending upon which historian you talk about. So again, these slave uprisings all have very common themes, and that's kind of what the authors are trying to get across. That's what, Kendi tries to kind of point out, is that it's not like they're not trying to gain their freedom, but the chips are definitely against them. Okay. Now, for this week, you have two assignments. One, you should have just completed here. You should have just completed the slave uprisings worksheet. Okay. Which was, on the week 6 list of assignments. The other one, I would like you, it's just a quirky little thing. I found a website that basically streams radio stations from around the world. So it's kind of neat. You know, you can tune into random radio stations and listen. What are they listening to? What I'd like you to do is go to Africa on the globe and just listen to some random radio stations from Africa. What are they listening to? Are they listening to American music? Are they listening to some sort of talk, political, talk or whatever else? What kind of languages can you pick up on? It's pretty interesting to kind of jump around Africa and see what they're listening to on the radio. So I'd like you to do that. There's a worksheet that goes along with that. Both of them together are 150 points. So this is a good week to get caught up on some of you that may be between grades. A couple of you are kind of flirting with failure for the elective course here. Again, this is just a course based upon effort. So please get some effort in this week to make sure you finish the quarter strong, because we're only a couple of weeks away from the end of the quarter. So if you have any questions, obviously office hours are still available most days at noon. And then, of course, you can always reach out to me via email or talk to me on Zoom calls. But it is 9:30. I want to respect your time and get you off to your third bell. So if you have any questions, feel free to stay behind. Otherwise, have a great day and enjoy your week. Stay safe and stay healthy.